Enthusiast for planets, third year, she's an astronomy student, and she's here to talk to us about the definition of planet.
Hello, this is a mostly humorous talk about my personal beef with the definition of the word planet. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn a little bit of something. So, if you guys were old enough to be able to form memories in 2006, I know that's not everyone here, but if you guys were, you probably have a pretty strong opinion about whether or not Pluto should be a planet, right? We've got Pluto truthers, we've got people that agree with the IAU, but it's a topic of controversy. So, let's talk about how we arrived here and what definition we ended up choosing and why I hate it. So, let's get started. So, the definition itself. It was chosen in 2006 by the International Astronomical Union, and it goes as follows. A planet is a celestial body that, 1, is in orbit around the sun. Note that it specifically says sun. Has sufficient mass to assume hydrostatic equilibrium. Fancy words, it means it's round. If something gets heavy enough, it pulls itself in all directions, ends up being round. And then 3, this is the phrasing they use, they never clarify this. The object has cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. So, this is a bit convoluted, it's a bit odd, it's not super straightforward. How did we get here? So, we've got to go back to the beginning. The word planet comes from the Greek word that means wanderer, because the original planets were these things, not just these things, but the planets that are visible to the naked eye, that they all sort of fall on this line we call the ecliptic. It's right here. So the original planets were the Sun, Mercury, Venus, the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. This was back before we knew that the Earth went around the Sun. All it was people, ancient civilizations, looking up at the sky and noticing that some of the brightest lights kind of wandered along this line. Look at the sky long enough, it looks a little weird. So they called them the wanderers, the planets, named them after their gods, and that was that. So these were the planets. Sun, Mercury, Venus, Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. You can see all of those with the naked eye. In fact, I think you can see all of them right now. Not right this second, but at some point during the night. So, obviously, this is different from our model today, but it was also a very long time ago. This didn't change until the 1500s when a guy named Copernicus came along in 1543. Near the end of his life, he published this idea that the sun doesn't go around Earth, instead, Earth goes around the sun. And it made sense because this is what his model looked like. That's very simple. To make all the other orbits work out, if Earth is at the center, they have to look like this. It made sense. But it didn't actually catch on for a few decades, so he didn't get much flack from it from the community. But eventually Galileo came along, popularized it, and eventually we had to accept it. So now the model of the solar system looked more like this. It was Mercury, Venus, Earth. The moon is no longer a planet, and neither is the sun. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So, a little bit more familiar, but we're missing a few. Again, it didn't change for a couple hundred years until we started building telescopes that were big enough to see stuff in the distant solar system. First one to be discovered was our favorite Uranus, discovered by a man named William Herschel. Funny thing, he initially wanted to name this planet George. He was a big fan of the British king at the time, that King George, you know, the one from the American Revolution, the crazy one. The Astronomical Society was not all British, and most people did not like this king. And so I am thoroughly convinced they were making fun of him when they chose Uranus instead. Both of those words existed back then, and you know what? Neptune hadn't been discovered yet. That name was still up for grabs. And what's more is Uranus is a titan, not a god like the rest of the planets. So they went out of their way to choose that name. I'm convinced they were making fun of him. So I do kind of prefer George just for the humor effect, but we can call it Uranus if we want to be polite. It's not that much better. So this was our model. Again, it didn't change for a few decades until we found Neptune. And so Uranus was our 7th planet. Neptune was our 12th. Wait, 12th? That's odd. I thought it would be the 8th. It's the 8th planet today, right? Well, we've got to backtrack a little bit and learn a little history lesson that you probably didn't learn in elementary school. So, 1801 saw the discovery of this thing, Ceres. It was a planet. When it was discovered, that's what they called it. It is now considered an asteroid. It's in between Mars and Jupiter. It's in the asteroid belt, and it is still the largest asteroid that we have found. So, they called it Ceres. They thought it was a planet, and they kept looking in the general area because, well, we found one. Maybe we'll find other things, right? And they did. They found Pallas, Vesta, and Juno. That is now 11 planets. And as they kept finding more and more and more, they were getting a little bit nervous that they were going to have to memorize several hundred planets. It felt strange to them. And the fact that they were all about the same size, in the same area, it just didn't seem like planets. You know, there was something different about them. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but they decided to say that a planet is not that. Eventually, you know, the model of the solar system is starting to look like, this. It's just odd, you know? There's not a specific thing here, it's just odd. So they decided to call this area the asteroid belt because they kept finding more and more. And we know it as the asteroid belt nowadays. It's this cloudy sort of region with a lot of asteroids in it. And then eventually Neptune was discovered and our model of the solar system looked like this. Then for another couple decades, it looked like that. And then in the 1930s, we found Pluto, planet 9. Things were stable again. Pluto made sense. It was the only thing of about its size in that area. It was smaller than Neptune by a long shot, but they didn't have any issue with it, you know? And people liked Pluto. People got attached to it. So for several decades, it remained a planet. But then, excuse me, something familiar started happening. This is not moving. Okay. Yeah. We started finding more. Quaoar, Haumea, Sedna, that's my personal favorite, and Makemake. So, these are all called dwarf planets nowadays. They are near Pluto, about the same size. And astronomers were getting worried. They were getting some deja vu here. Similarly sized objects all around the same area. They decided to call that area the Kuiper Belt. So it looks kind of like the asteroid belt. It's quite a bit bigger. The objects in it are quite a bit bigger, but it's the same principle. But this is the late 90s, early 2000s. Pluto is still a planet because it's the biggest one, and people like Pluto. So they said as long as Pluto is the largest one out there, it will keep its planetary status just for nostalgia purposes, right? You want to know what happened in 2005? In comes Eris with the steel chair. Eris is slightly larger than Pluto, and Mike Brown named her after the goddess of discord for a very good reason. We finally had to sit down and actually define what it means to be a planet, because until then there wasn't a good definition. It was just a list. It was a list that we just kept nudging and changing based on this like vague, intuitive idea of what a planet should be. So we finally decided to write it down. And let me just remind you what it is. It has to be an orbiter on the sun, round, and mostly alone in its orbit. So the idea, you can see what the idea was, right? Exclude the stuff in the asteroid belt, exclude the stuff in the Kuiper belt, keep the other 8. And they thought that these criteria covered the planets we wanted, excluded the ones we didn't. A lot of people were mad about this. Fun fact, this vote by the IAU happened at the end of a 10-day conference. Most of the astronomers that attended that conference had already left, and most of the astronomers that were part of the IAU hadn't even shown up because it was in Belgium. Most of them could not fly there to physically be there to vote. So, of the 9,000 members of the IAU in 2006, only 400 voted on this, and it was a close vote. So, The astronomy community wasn't super happy because they didn't get to make this decision. Some of the people who were most mad about this was the team working on New Horizons. You guys probably heard about that probe. It went to the edge of our solar system, edge, however you define it. It went towards Pluto. It was being put together in 2006. They were excited about it. Then suddenly, their fancy probe to go monitor the most distant planet suddenly wasn't going to a planet anymore. It was going to a tiny minor planetoid, a dwarf planet. They didn't like that. They were afraid their funding would be cut. It wasn't. It eventually made it up, but they were mad. I personally am mad about this definition because it's not consistent. And I want to go through all the little tiny nitpicks and major flaws that I have with this definition. The first criterion I'm mad about for a few reasons. It specifically states the sun, and this was on purpose. It's vague why they chose this in particular, but it did happen after, and I quote, secret meetings with an unknown committee in between sessions of this discussion. I don't know what they traded for this. I don't know who got paid, but someone had a vested interest in excluding exoplanets because we had found several exoplanets at the time, but they wanted them excluded from the definition. Now, exoplanet, planet beyond our solar system. You'd think they would be planets, but they are not. None of these are planets. I don't know why. No one knows why, except for the people in the secret meetings. And then on top of that, this is more nitpicky, but nothing orbits the sun. We orbit the solar system's center of gravity. And, believe it or not, Jupiter and Saturn are large enough, massive enough, to sometimes pull it outside of the sun's radius, up to 2 solar radii out. So, we don't orbit the sun, we orbit the solar system's center of gravity. I get that the definition was trying to exclude moons, but this is what it did instead. Technically, nothing's a planet. Now, my issue with the second criterion is not as big, but it's a good lower bound. Big enough to be round, right? Certain mass you have to be a planet. There's not an upper limit, and that causes problems with these things. They're called brown dwarf stars. Failed stars, give or take. They don't do fusion with hydrogen. They don't really burn the same way as other stars, but they're big enough to fuse deuterium. And the definition doesn't exclude, they exclude it because they don't go around the sun, but if you ignore that, there's not a good upper limit for mass. So technically, these would be if there was one going around the sun. That's odd. Now, for the last criterion about clearing the debris. Contrary to popular belief, Pluto being excluded wasn't because it wasn't big enough, it was because it hasn't cleared the debris. However, I have some nitpicks and some legitimate concerns. So this is our solar system out to Jupiter. Okay, so when two things orbit each other, these little gravity wells form. They're called Lagrange points, but this is Jupiter. These are two of its Lagrange points. They've caught a lot of asteroids. Jupiter's big, it catches a lot of stuff. It's actually pretty useful. It keeps a lot of asteroids from hitting Earth. But I don't know about you, but that looks like uncleared debris. There's debris in its orbit. Jupiter shouldn't be a planet. I don't think it should be a planet, at least not under this definition. On a more serious note though, if Pluto and Earth traded places, Earth would not have enough mass to clear its debris out in Pluto's orbit. And there's a few reasons for this. Pluto's orbit is big. That's Neptune's orbit. This is Pluto. Earth is this tiny thing in here. Earth has gone around the sun about 4 billion times, right? Pluto's orbit is about 248 Earth years. So it's only gone around about 16 million. That's 2 orders of magnitude difference. So it has not gone around in its orbit nearly as many times as Earth has. When Earth was 16 million years old, we didn't even have oxygen here yet. Pluto has not had enough time to actually clear its debris, and its orbit is big enough that there's more of it in there. So this part of the definition has nothing to do with the planet itself and everything to do with where it came from. I don't know, it sounds discriminatory. So, on a more serious note, it's odd that we're choosing about where it's located versus the object itself. So, I don't really like that. Then finally, this is a nitpick because it's my personal favorite dwarf planet, but I want to talk to you about Sedna for like a few seconds. Yeah, so this is Sedna's orbit. For reference, that's Pluto. Sedna's all the way out there, so this is Pluto's orbit. There's nothing out there. Sedna's way out there. It's way past the Kuiper Belt. There's no debris in its orbit. But it wasn't considered a planet even though it was discovered 3 years before the convention. It's big enough to be round. It orbits the sun. There is no debris in its orbit. But it's not included. Why? Because no one had heard of her. So, I think it's dumb. All right, final little nitpick. That's Jupiter. This is Mercury. Why are these two things the same thing? And now that's Mercury. This is Pluto. These two are the same type of thing. These two are not. I don't like that. Does anybody else think that's odd? So, it's odd to me. This is not a very well done definition. But what makes a definition good? Let's talk about that. So, this is what I've come up with. I'm not a linguist. I'm just someone who's put into it. But I think a good definition has a few criteria. It has to encapsulate the intuitively understood meaning. We all have an idea of what a planet means, right? It's a thing out in space that goes around a star, and it's big, right? You could probably land on it, or maybe it's big enough to be a gas giant or something, but we have an idea in our heads, and it should probably match that, right? That makes it an effective tool for communication. When I say planet, I want it to mean the same thing to someone who doesn't study astronomy and to someone who does, at least on a communication level, right? If I say there's a planet going around Tau Ceti, I want that to actually mean planet, right? Because you would think it means planet. And then finally, it also needs to be scientifically useful, because this is a science definition, right? It has to be useful for categorizing things and for research purposes. So I've come up with what I think is a better definition. Yes, I'm saying I'm better than the IAU. I'm not afraid to say that. I think a planet should be a celestial object that is in hydrostatic equilibrium. I like that part. It means big enough to be round. That makes sense. It needs to orbit at least one star and not orbit a planet. So it's not a moon, but it orbits at least one star. This includes exoplanets. It includes exoplanets that orbit multiple stars because a lot of star systems are binaries or more. So, orbits at least one star but not a planet. And is unable to perform nuclear fusion. So, brown dwarfs can do some types of nuclear fusion, but not specifically hydrogen, so they're excluded here. And then I have some footnotes as well. Large ejected objects, rogue planets, are included. Rogue planets are things that look like planets but aren't in a solar system. They've been ejected from their solar system and just flying through space. They're kind of scary, but they're also kind of cool. They should be included. They're like planets, right? And then I also want to include double, triple, etc. planets are also included. Pluto has a very, very, very large moon compared to it. Their center of gravity is in between them. So under this definition, Pluto and Charon, its largest moon, would be a double planet. Now, this encloses a lot of things. I think it would be a little hard for first graders to memorize all of these, right? There's got to be like several hundred objects in our solar system that meet these. So I have subcategories, because we're scientists, we love boxes. Gas giants. We know what gas giants are. Big things made of gas, but not stars. And then I have large terrestrials. Mostly solid planets that are by far the most gravitationally dominant objects in their neighborhood. So, with the exclusion of double planets, thing that's not in the asteroid belt or Kuiper belt or something similar, and not the moons, again. And then finally, small terrestrials. Not those. So, what do you guys think? Do you think this is a good definition? Do you have nitpicks? Are you mad at the IAU? As mad as I am? I want to hear what you think. So, thank you.
Questions for Audrey?
other thing that happened. It was not as momentous, but it was about the new Coke. So Coca-Cola introduced a new flavor of Coke, and they call it the new Coke. And it ended up being an advertising thing. Do you think that in a few years the AU will call Pluto again a planet, and we're going to have again all this discussion?
I hope so. But I hope if they do it, they're actually systematic about it and they do it with care and purpose and not just for, I don't know, press reasons. I think that there's an opportunity to actually examine our definition we've made, be willing to question the conventions. So if they do decide to bring this discussion up again just for the sake of getting people to talk about astronomy, I hope that they at least do it with care.
So I know Sedna is your favorite, like, non-planet object. Do you have a least favorite?
Horror is a weird name. Mike Brown is the guy that named it. He was not allowed to name his daughter because he chose that name for a dwarf planet. His wife was afraid that he would choose something unpronounceable. What is it?
It reminds me of the Nestra thing. Have you heard of where a man named his daughter Nestra, and years later they found out it was his favorite football team, Arsenal, but it was.
No, that's horrible. Oh, that's horrible. Anything else? Any other ideas? Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you. I hope you guys learned something and enjoyed it.